Hi, I'm Dr. Hans Tokke, and this is another City Insight. Welcome to my students, urban worker colleagues, friends, and interested people. I welcome your comments, feedback, and questions along the way. Today's topic is Code of the Street. We'll be discussing the classic social theory of Elijah Anderson that continues to this day in helping us to understand how urban youth learn to survive in the streets. We'll link this to family types and integrate it ultimately with the discussion on policing and police brutality. In the end, we'll finish with the Cosmopolitan Canopy that updates the original Code of the Street, what I think is the most brilliant explanation out there of the Trayvon Martin case. The book we're referencing today is Anderson's theory that is drawn from his early work, Code of the Street, published in and around the early 1970s. It's been reproduced in numerous ways, from textbooks to journals to lectures. Indeed, I've used this many, many times in classrooms of different forms, including online and conventional classrooms. I'm going to finish today with his latest book, Cosmopolitan Canopy, that contemporizes the early work in this new theory of the iconic ghetto versus the real ghetto, which I think updates the original Code of the Street, which doesn't make the Code of the Street illegitimate or not valuable, but indeed it builds on a great theory. I'll also make a comparison with Robert Putnam's theory of the two-tiered family from his book, Our Kids. So much of my commentary today is drawn from students at Charter Oak State College, the City University of New York, and several other students I've interacted with along the way, and urban workers I've known over the years. So you might recognize some of your comments, or you might be familiar with things that I've said elsewhere before. Anyways, on to Anderson's Code of the Street. Anderson's Code of the Street says this: it's a set of informal rules governing interpersonal public behavior, including violence. He takes his basic idea that people in urban neighborhoods learn how to act in order to survive on the streets and in difficult neighborhoods. He links this to types of families that act in different ways when confronting the rules of the street. Indeed, no family is exactly the same in an urban context, particularly an inner city one. He basically says there are two types of families that a child may grow up in an inner city. The first is the decent family. These are families who enforce good values on their children. The second is the street family. These families abide by the code of the streets. The third and final type, that is sort of a combination of the two of them, is the family who enforces values but also teaches their children how to handle themselves on the streets and to be familiar with this code of the streets. Indeed, you only survive on the streets if you know the code of the streets. Some families shelter their kids from the code of the streets. Other ones live right inside the streets. Thus, we have this dichotomy of the two types of families. If you've read Putnam's Our Kids, did you notice the similarity between Putnam's take on class and Anderson's? Anderson sees he sees differences even in poverty between the way families function, which is more adept at understanding the simplistic two-tiered approach of Putnam. What Putnam says is there's upper-class families and lower-class families. Upper-class families have education, lower-class families do not. It's somewhat of a simplistic format, though certainly not illegitimate. But I would argue that Putnam's construct is pretty stereotypical, that education drives everything. Anderson picks up on more of a street sense, that there's an education of the street. This is the code of the street. So there are codes even for the way a family functions that must be learned. Anderson's perspective of the decent street peoples is a dichotomy of two archetypes that is hauntingly similar to this two-tiered approach of Putnam. It creates the educated and the uneducated. Whereas Putnam says it's education, formal, college or not. With Anderson, it's understanding the education of the streets, knowing it or not. I'm concerned that both of these oversimplify the truth into a nice dualistic construct that can be articulated in an article and for public consumption. So for my students, colleagues, urban workers, I think we need to be careful not to overly emphasize that there's just this two-tiered approach or this dichotomy because it can oversimplify it. That being said, that doesn't make it illegitimate or wrong. The two tiers of the inner city family reflect almost two tiers of Putnam's ideas of how a family is lived out in the upper class and lower class. In this case, the strict family value has control over children that are very aware of what's going on. Conversely, street parents cannot cope with the children and have an inability to understand even the codes that their kids live under. The environment can swallow the kid without having a parent that's going to influence and change those social roles of living out on the street. Anderson does describe the defined social roles that are formed within these different family structures as codes of the street. It's true that we need to understand the variances that exist even within the context of poverty in the inner city, but the learned behaviors make work with urban youth more complex, is that there's no one simple approach to help them achieve a better lifestyle. I'm very focused on this, that there's no one simple approach, though we do need these constructs to help us understand a little bit more of what's going on. I appreciate how some students or people or urban workers emphasize aggression that takes place within a family context. Indeed, family violence, domestic violence, cannot be underestimated as an influencer. Indeed, I've had to deal with these same kind of behaviors with community college students that are overly aggressive and can't seem to unpack into a different culture in a classroom that street lingo that they've learned, or that street life they've learned. Indeed, the other day, just one of my students blew up in the cafeteria and was hauled off by public safety. Teaching across this variance, or doing urban work across this variance, is a difficult thing to do. Wyatt states it this way, that many kids don't have a lot of options if they're born into the code of the streets, and that's why they've known, and that's what they follow all their life. These kids know violence, and they believe that violence, aggressive talk, pushing against someone can solve all problems. They're the perfect example of this environment of the code of the streets. They've emblazoned themselves and branded themselves as a violent character. And this carries off, into the community college lunchroom, where they get into an argument with someone else, not knowing how to deal with a proper, simple conversation. Whoops, sorry about that. Many kids don't have the option to get out, and they are born into these cold streets. If you read Anderson, did you notice how he describes the code of the street as informal? But when we look at it closely, though informal in the way one learns the code of the streets, the rules are actually quite formal and enforce the rules in the neighborhood. Someone who's savvy in the code of the street will understand these rules, and they can exist fairly well and rise out of it, as someone who cannot will have trouble or might indeed get sucked in to more violent and difficult elements of living in the neighborhood. What we are sure of is that social conditions do create the social roles where Anderson is showing us through his ethnographic approach of research of how relationships with people have and do influence the way they actually act and create rules with the way they live amongst one another. The code of the street creates the social rules that people operate within. One of my students emphasized this conflict as it comes between churchgoers in a neighborhood and the evil temptations of the neighborhood. It creates a separate dichotomy between those who believe in their church values compared to the evil values of the street. Thus, we can't go with the two-tiered approach of Putnam exclusively that says upper class, lower class, because there's such a different way in the way people have codes that they live by the feet on the street of the church. By their feet in the street or in the church. So people create different environments in the church compared to the way they live in the street. So these class structures intermingle, change, and shift. I think that's where I'm going with this. Anderson also observes that street families show a lack of respect and consideration for others. This may actually be, I think, a protection mechanism, as they don't believe they have safety from others on the street. Survival is true, but is also accomplished in ways the middle-class person may not understand, or indeed the decent families may not understand. So this aggressive behavior of the code of the street is actually a protective survival mechanism, not necessarily an aggression to hurt somebody else. So these confusing signals are really important. If we follow this circle further, it reiterates a discussion on the culture of poverty that I've had in other places, indeed in our City Insight on poverty. People do circle within the same influences and social roles that have determined who they are. Anderson in the Code of the Street also shows how social roles are influenced by one's environment, and it's difficult to break free. I become the street. So I think it's safe to say that these archetypes do exist. So I'm not debating that. But I do challenge that we do not live only by this understanding of urban youth. If we do, we endanger ourselves into stereotyping just as much as others might, as there are these simple constructs of people. I challenge anyone watching this to not to be drawn in too much to seeing the city from these simplistic constructs, where youth are bad if they come from street homes, and youth are better if they come from respectable homes. Be careful on this. The circle, the dynamics, the roles are so varied. While talking about the code of the street, we have to bring policing into the discussion. It's certainly apropos in this environment of police brutality that's increased in the inner city, where the street culture rules, and yet where the police will be less apt to go. We should consider broken windows theory being used here in New York City to pull petty crime off of the streets in order to change the environment of the streets. Some argue that this idea of community policing that's going on here in the city now to shift the culture of the street to one that is more palatable for the average person actually increases real estate values and pushes out the poor of the neighborhood alongside the crime that goes with it. Some say this is a really good thing. Get the poor people, get the crime out, real estate values rise, and what? More respectable, quote, quote, families move in. Think, for instance, the petty crime of cigarettes. This is the Eric Garner case that took place here in New York City, where he was accused of selling loose cigarettes. This caused a brutality case where the police confronted him. He died from asphyxiation or some other medical condition. So an argument is out there that broken windows policing, which takes petty crime off the streets, is dangerous for the minority who do not abide directly by the code of the police, but live by the rules of the street. Indeed, Eric Garner, I would argue, probably believed that I'm not going to get arrested for selling loosies. It's just a petty crime. And this is how we make money in the neighborhood. It's just what we do. It is a rule of the street. The unfairness to which police will respond to troubling inner city neighborhoods is clear. It is true, since police are not going to help those in troubled neighborhoods, they find other codes of protection. For instance, in housing projects where the police have booked out, often criminal gangs can become not only the ones that protect people from other gangs and from violence from others, but also, of course, control the drug trade within that neighborhood. So one, good, begets a bad. Protection begets other types of violence. It's this negotiation that takes place. They're antithesis of one another, a paradox, opposites that attract. Therefore, it's critical for police to have a strong understanding of their community rather than confronting it with codes of the middle class that have no understanding of the codes of the street. The concept of community policing is emerging these days and hopefully will allow the police to walk the streets of violent neighborhoods with a sense that they can make it a palatable place to live, where people do not have to depend on gangs to protect themselves. Police brutality is an important related topic, and it highlights the conflict these days that we see. It does show us where decent rules may be what is expected of all people, whether they know how to live these rules or not. This is a decent family versus the irrespectable, the street family, or the respectable family versus a street family. Thus, when they do not live according to the code of the police or the code of the middle class that determines how policing should be done, and revert to the street rules and street behaviors, a fight or a conflict is inevitable. This becomes more apt when the code of the street is carried out into incarceration. I live just a few minutes here from Rikers Island, and have had the privilege or humbling experience of being involved in a Monday program with an organization called Street to Street that helps mentoring young incarcerated males between 17 and 20 years of age that come from our inner cities. In prison, in its institutional environment, it aims to reform the criminal by indoctrinating them to the codes of the jail, which represents the codes of the justice system. If you were to come into Rikers with me, you would see young men between 17 and 19 years of age being chained together like a chain gang out from the gymnasium and to their cells. It shows a very different world than the one I live in. I'm never chained to anything. Thus, the rules of the prison become its own rules of the street. Because while this isn't taking place, these young men also bring the code of the street. Indeed, in this case, the Lincoln gangs in Brooklyn, where it may be even more intense than it ever was in the sidewalks of the neighborhood. Indeed, the violence that can take place behind the jail cell can become more intense, more difficult to deal with, and not reformable in incarceration. So indeed, it is difficult to be reformed in jail. Middle class values will never become part of their lifestyle or the way they think and operate within the way we do reformation and incarceration in jail these days. There must be an attempt to understand the place of where the young man comes in with the rules of the street into prison, and then how can we work with one another. Anderson uses this term, idiomatic laws. Idiom, an English term. Laws formed by understanding the language of the people in the street and how people act, to show how there's a conflict between what the broader public expects from its police force in contrast to what the neighborhood may expect. One of my students demonstrated this in a research project in Flatbush recently, a neighborhood here in Brooklyn. He was looking at how people from the neighborhood react to the facial expressions of the police themselves. In a culminating instance, there was a shooting in his neighborhood, and the people all ran to see what was going on. The police were also attending the scene and began asking if anybody had any information about what was going on. Everybody said, "I don't know anything, I don't know anything." They didn't say anything to the police. Yet the interesting discovery of my student was word started getting around through a different language code where people were using code names for who they knew that the police didn't understand. So the code rules of the street around this shooting subverted the police ability to gain information about a crime taking place. People did not want to get involved, or they knew how to get back what they needed to know in order to get back at whoever did the crime. So, as the case here in Flatbush and many others, where the code of the street is in conflict with the police, is where we get a cauldron for fights and mistakes and misunderstandings between law enforcement and the people. It's no accident that much of what we see on mass media about police brutality takes place in urban neighborhoods where there is this misunderstanding between how the law is applied between people. Further, I think you can carry this to the way traffic stops, for instance, have a certain code of expectation. You've seen this many times on your Facebook feed or wherever you might be, where someone has a viral type of camera description of being stopped by the police. The police officer expects you to behave in a certain way, and this indeed might be racialized based on their perception of a crime by the driver or its passengers. If one does not follow the code of the officers and reverts to their own social codes of how to behave with authority, which may be antagonistic, it opens the pathway to unwanted results. Indeed, when the code of the police at the traffic stop confronts the code of the street with a driver who does not respond in exactly the way the police officer wants, we then get the clash. Indeed, we get shootings. For this reason, many minority parents that I've met spend significant time training the young boys in particular how to act when they encounter police, which may be in conflict with what they've learned from the streets. So you act one way to the police versus one way on the street. The two do not translate into the similar environments. This is where I think Elijah Anderson's somewhat dated article is now extremely important. The idea of the code of the street requires parents now to teach their kids the code of the police or the code of the middle class in order to survive. Yet, if there isn't the parent teaching or other methods to help teach these kids these codes, these kids are doomed to failure. Indeed, may end up incarcerated. In light of this, I think some of us overstate the case that the streets are becoming more unsafe. This article was written based on research done in the early 70s, and things have changed a lot since then, though some things do remain the same. I would argue this comes from media that now is exposing situations that in the past we didn't hear about. Sensational media will highlight what bleeds and leave your crime story being much more interesting than the average daily life at the office. So what makes the news? The crime. But I don't want us to undermine the importance of police brutality in this discussion by brushing it off with lower crime rates. Crime rates are down significantly from the 70s, 80s, and 90s when this article was written. However, crime has also moved to the suburbs and exurbs because the poor have been pushed out of the city due to broken windows policies that's getting crime off the streets in big cities here like New York in order to raise its real estate values and push the poor out of the city itself. So those of you living in suburbs and exurbs where the poor are now coming in, with it also draws with it the code of the streets. Well, we cannot leave Anderson's discussion of the code of the streets without mentioning his latest work, which is brilliant, The Cosmopolitan Canopy. I encourage you to pick up his book and read it. I love it. I had the privilege to attend a presentation of his where he laid out this new theoretical framework, which is the iconic ghetto compared to the real ghetto. In the Cosmopolitan Canopy, he argues that we all live as diverse peoples under the same canopy of life. Now, more than ever before in America, we confront people of difference. As we confront people of difference, we're more apt to get into conflicts and disagreements based on our own social roles and stereotypes that we carry with us. One of these locations is understanding the culture of the young African-American male. The iconic ghetto is a young African-American male who is from the middle class, or what might have previously have been articulated as the decent family or the respectable family, but wears the same clothing and style as someone who's grown up in poverty or as the street family. The signature hoodie and sneakers align this iconic ghetto concept. He is essentially dressing down to appear to have street credit, or street cred as some call it, or to abide by it formally would be known as the code of the street. Someone who wants to live the code of the street and its culture, even though they don't come from the street. The real ghetto, conversely to this, is someone who dresses similarly, but does so because they live this life every day. Though they have critical details that make them different, and someone knows intimate details of the codes of this ghetto will know them too. There's these little things that they can see that makes you real or not real, authentic or fake. To the average person living under the Cosmopolitan Canopy, they'll view the iconic ghetto kid in the same way as the real ghetto kid. You really can't tell the difference. Indeed, I wonder if you could. Maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. I sometimes have a tricky part of this. Sadly, Anderson notes that hip-hop artists do Americans no favor in helping us see the differences between these two starkly different life backgrounds. Why is this an issue? Because in the end, we end up with cases such as Trayvon Martin, where there is a misunderstanding if this was a real ghetto kid or an iconic ghetto kid. Zimmerman, the shooter who killed Martin, clearly identified the boy with the hoodie as a real ghetto kid up to no good and stereotyped him. It may not have been the truth at all. That doesn't matter. What Anderson said, he misread it. This is the Cosmopolitan Canopy and work. And we can expect more of these encounters where the code of the street, the old way of looking at it, or the real ghetto, compared to the respectable family or the iconic ghetto, come into clash with one another. While in the end, one of our goals as urban workers and teachers is building happiness. Indeed, as the happiness index increases, so does the quality of life in the neighborhood. But how do you do this? I'm not sure. Are you? There are various different social programs that attempt to address increasing the happiness index in order to make life on the streets better with less despair. Some do it well, others do not. It is, however, important to distinguish hardcore street youth from youth in general. I've had many students who have grown up with the code of the streets and are able to break through and gain an education and increase their prospects. They do not follow this circle that we've talked about. So let's not be drawn too far into sensational hopelessness in thinking about urban youth. But let's be hopeful that many of them can raise their values and move out of the degradation of the court of the street that decides how they're to live. The lesson learned for all of us from Anderson is to be careful in how we understand the different social roles and codes we bring to ghetto kids. The code of the street can stereotype just as much as the iconic or real ghetto. It's incumbent on anyone who's going to be involved in urban education or human services to understand these codes and not to be driven by the middle class values that may hinder them to understanding where the youth really come from. I would say this also is true for people working in Rikers Island. I'm Dr. Hans Tokke, and this has been another City Insight. I welcome your comments and reaction. We'll see you next time, here from New York City.